So for this video, I'm going to talk about cardiac output and kind of how it's regulated. So you got cardiac output, which always is measured in liters per minute of the heart. And basically, there's three factors that kind of affect cardiac output. You got the preload, the afterload, and the contractility. Okay, so the preload is basically how much volume of blood that's going to be flowing back into the heart to help it pump. And so that's kind of it's determined by the venous blood return, which is kind of in relation to the right atrial pressure as well. And we'll be looking at the right atrial pressure. Okay, so as the right atrial pressure increases, it can push more blood into the ventricle, which will help increase the output. So if you increase this, you're going to increase the output, cardiac output. Okay? The afterload is how much resistance the heart has to go against when it's pumping. So if there's a high blood pressure or if there's a lot of vascular resistance, basically that's going to prevent the ventricle from completely emptying, and so that's going to so the preload will actually it'll increase the end systolic and diastolic volume will increase. If you increase the afterload, you're actually going to decrease, or what you'll do is you'll increase the end systolic volume. Okay, and the cardiac output is the cardiac output is all relative to the end diastolic volume minus the end systolic volume, basically times the heart rate. Okay, so this is how much the heart pumps each time times the heart rate. So if you increase the end systolic volume, what you're going to do is you're actually going to decrease the output of the heart with each pump, and so that's going to decrease it decreases the cardiac output. Okay, last thing, contractility. So the contractility is how much the heart can pump, and or how strongly the heart is pumping, and so it's independent of the preload or the afterload. And so this is basically regulated by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And para. And basically when the heart's innervated by the vagus nerve and also the sympathetic nerves. And so if the sympathetic nerves activate, what they do is they increase the heart rate, okay, and they also stimulate increased contraction. Okay, so that's all things that regulate the cardiac output. So now, if you were to graph the cardiac output, what you'll see is that, so we graph it actually relative to the right atrial pressure. Okay, and then this is cardiac output. Okay, so if you graph the average cardiac output, what you'll see is, so this is like 0 if it's minus 2, minus 4, and let's just say 2, 4, and over here is like 8. So if you graph the average cardiac output, what you'll see is around minus 2, the ventricle doesn't even really fill up because there's a negative pressure, so the blood won't even be flowing into the ventricle, and so there'll be no cardiac output, and it will increase relatively quickly, and then it'll reach a peak at about plus or minus like 4 millimeters change in pressure. And so you'll see a slope like this, and you'll see that the cardiac output actually increases relatively quickly, and then at the top it plateaus pretty quickly, and that's just because the ventricle, once it's reached its max, it's not going to stretch anymore, so it'll just reach a max up here, right? And so that max is about like 12 liters per minute, approximately. Okay, and then there's things that it can happen that basically change you can shift it left or right, and also you can compress or expand it. So things that are going to affect how the heart's filling up is basically the interpleural pressure, because the pleura is surrounding the heart, right? So you have a heart, and then you have the pleura of the lungs kind of like around it. And so this pleura is usually at about -2 millimeters of Hg. -2 or was it -4? Don't quote me on this. It might actually be -4. But yeah, so it's basically it's a negative pressure, right? So it's because it's a negative pressure, it's subatmospheric. It's going to be pulling out on the heart, and so the heart wants to fill up with this pressure. Okay. If you increase the interpleural pressure, so that it's now a positive number, so say it's +2, what that's going to do is now it's actually going to be compressing on the heart. So you're going to need more right atrial pressure to fill it up. So what you'll see is a shift. And so you'll see it shifted like this. It can still fill up the same amount, right? But you'll just need more right atrial pressure to overcome that interpleural pressure. So this is like an interpleural pressure of 2, say. Interpleural of 2. 2, say this is -2. And then you can draw one even down here. Say it's like -4. Okay, so that's how they shift left or right, depending on the interpleural pressure. They can also shift, you can change the cardiac output, like I said, by the contractility. So it's all about how it's innervated. So if you have a parasympathetic innervation, you'll see that the cardiac output is decreased. So let's say it decreases it by 50%. So you'll see the curve, it'll still start at about the same point, but it'll max out at about 6, and same if you increase it, the contractility, you can get it to max out a lot higher, right? So basically it's just contracting more, which increases, what it will do is you'll increase the end systolic volume, or it'll actually decrease the end systolic volume, right? When you increase the contractility, because the ventricle can empty more, and so that will increase the cardiac output. So that's the cardiac output graph. And now going on to venous return. So what actually regulates the cardiac output is more determined by the venous return, because the heart is basically, it's all dependent on how much blood is flowing into it, and if more blood is flowing into it, it'll just pump harder to get that blood out. So the venous return is what's actually determining how much blood is returning to it. So if you're to graph the venous return, basically it has the same x-axis. It's also dependent on the right atrial pressure. But what you'll see is it'll actually, as the right atrial pressure increases, for the cardiac output, it increased, right? But it's the opposite, or it's the inverse for venous return, because as the right atrial pressure increases, it's going to create a backflow of the blood, and less venous blood is going to return into the heart because it's got to go against that pressure gradient. So what you'll see is you'll see a graph like this, and it'll basically go at a regular rate, and it'll cross at a point right here, and say this is 8 millimeters of Hg. That point is actually the point, it's called the mean systemic filling pressure, which I'll explain right away, and where it crosses is where it's also equal to the right atrial pressure. Okay, so venous blood return is dependent on 3 things. Okay, so there's 3 things that affect venous blood return. There's how much, it's called mean systemic filling pressure there is. So that's how much pressure, if you stop the heart from pumping and you just let all the blood just pool and just relax, that's how much pressure basically the vessels are closing in on that blood, okay? And so what you'll see is with an increase in volume, so if you increase the volume of the blood, basically you're going to increase the pressure because it's going to stretch out those vessels and they're going to retract more and create more pressure. Okay, so that's the mean systemic, it's called the mean systemic filling pressure. One thing is you can't actually measure the mean systemic filling pressure because it's just looking at the systemic circulatory system. What you'll see is mean circulatory filling pressure, and so that also includes the pulmonary. So the mean circulatory just includes the systemic system plus the pulmonary, but we're not worried about the pulmonary because that's a different circulatory system for the venous blood return. So the mean systemic filling pressure is basically PSF, okay? And then something that's preventing venous blood return, like we talked about, is the right atrial pressure, because as the right atrial pressure increases, that pressure is going to resist more blood coming into the right atrium, right? So the pressure of the right atrium. And the last thing that's going to affect it is the resistance to venous return. Okay, because as the resistance increases, it's going to slow down the blood and less blood is going to be coming back to the heart. Okay. So now when you're graphing these, you can graph this graph can also change relative to all these variables. So like I said, this is at 8 millimeters. So what we point out on this graph is this is an 8 PSF. So the mean systemic thing of 8. So now if you increase that, to 16, what it will do is it'll just cross at 16, okay? And it will still go up at the same regular rate because it's all about the difference between these two pressures, right? So if this point right here is when they're both equal, the right atrial pressure and the mean systemic filling pressure are both 16. Since the difference will be 0, then it'll cross and there won't be any cardiac or any venous return, basically venous blood return. So this volume is also in liters per minute, by the way. Okay, and it'll still increase with the same slope because it's all relative to the difference. And what you'll see is at about -2 millimeters of Hg, it'll hit a plateau, and it'll plateau like this. The reason for the plateau is basically if you have any more negative pressure, as the right atrial is sucking the blood in, it creates the negative pressure on the valves, or on the vessels, and the vessels collapse on each other. And so you can't get any faster blood return because the vessels are collapsing. So this is where the vessels collapse. So those veins are collapsing on each other. And so there's the 16, and you can also get it, say, like here. And you'll see that they all have the same slope, all relative to and they all cross at different points relative to their mean systemic filling pressure. Another thing that you can change is you can change the resistance, and the resistance actually changes the slope. So it'll still cross at the same point on the graph, but you'll see that the slope has been changed, and it can actually, the venous return will actually increase and decrease that way. So if I drew it like this, so say this is still 8. Okay, so this is 8 now. What you'll see is if it's half the resistance, it'll be twice the slope, and it'll go twice as high, and then plateau. Okay, 2 times the resistance, it'll be half as high, like that. Okay, so that's how it changes relative to resistance. One thing that you can do, like I said, with the systemic filling pressure is because it's all relative to the volume, you could say if somebody has too low of the systemic filling pressure, you need to increase the venous return, is you can infuse blood. And you'll see that it's actually quite effective initially, because if you drew here, this is the volume, and this is the pressure. and say that the mean systemic filling pressure was 4 millimeters, and they were at 3,000 milliliters of blood. You'll see that even the smallest increase of even like a 500 milliliters infusion of blood could increase the mean systemic filling pressure quite a bit. And actually in the textbook they draw a couple different graphs simultaneously. Basically, so this would say this is the normal one. If you give sympathetic innervation, what it does is it contracts all the vessels. That'll increase the pressure even more. So this is sympathetic. And this is parasympathetic because it relaxes the vessels. So you'll actually relax it, the vessels dilate, you need more volume to get the same amount of pressure. So if somebody's going into shock, one of the most effective ways of treating the shock is to give them an infusion. This is a short-term fix though, because what ends up happening is, so you'll increase the pressure temporarily, but there's the mechanism of the vessels, the stress relaxation of the veins. Basically the smooth muscles in the veins will dilate to compensate for the increased volume, which will decrease the pressure. And also the increased pressure will cause more fluids to actually leak out into the tissues, so that the volume of the blood will actually, it'll go back to normal again. So, and that can happen in about half an hour after infusion. So, why do we graph all this stuff? Basically, the main reason for it is you can determine what the cardiac output is based on the venous blood return. So what I said was, say that you know that the venous blood return, it's operating like this. Okay, and say it's crossing, so this, we'll say it's crossing at 8 again. Okay, and we know that the heart will go back to the normal, that's a normal system, and the heart is pumping like this. Okay, now it's crossing up here, so this cardiac output, so that point right there, say that's the right atrial pressure of 0 millimeters of Hg. And this is where the cardiac output, so the amount that the heart is pumping out, will equal the venous blood return, which is actually the blood coming into the heart, right? They have to be equal. And so that would be determined in the heart, let's say it's 12 liters per minute. So that's what determines what the cardiac output is. And then you can change the graphs, kind of like what I said. They shift relative to different factors. And so you can do all those different shifts and you can see how that's going to change the cardiac output.